Hello, I'm going to mix brioche dough. First, a little background. Brioche is one of the most extraordinary doughs possible for your repertoire. One reason is because it's so delicious, refined, and elegant. Another reason is because it's extremely versatile. You can do beautiful, beautiful arrays of sweetened products with it. You can laminate it as if it were puff pastry and have a brioche feuilletée. You can make all manner of savory products with it. So it's just all over the place. And I'm sure if you really developed a love for brioche, I'm not exaggerating to say you could come up with at least 50 different products to make with it. So I'll show you how to do the mix now. There are a few basic rules to mixing brioche dough. If you look at the formula, you'll see that 50% of the flour weight is butter. And one thing we have to do to mix well is to start with very, very cold ingredients, refrigerated ingredients. The reason for that is the following. We're going to have a pretty strong development to the base dough. By base dough, I mean all the ingredients except the butter. And the reason we have to have a fairly strong development is so that our dough can lift up all that butter and we can get a light textured brioche rather than a heavy bomb of a brioche. So why would that entail chilling all your ingredients? For the following reason. To get that strong base dough, it takes a comparatively long time to mix. As the dough is mixing, friction is developed as a result of the hook's action upon the dough. The friction warms up the dough. And if we started at room temperature ingredients, particularly on a day like today where it's in the mid-80s in Vermont, which is pretty extraordinary, if we started with room temperature ingredients, the danger is that by the time we develop the dough to enough strength and then added the butter, we might have a greasy brioche because the dough is too warm. That would be a defect. So by pre-scaling your ingredients at least a couple hours before the mix, or even better overnight, everything is chilled, every single ingredient. It all goes into the mixing bowl with the exception of the butter. And sometimes without the sugar. Let me explain that and then I'll start the mix. As a general rule, it's easier to develop the gluten in any kind of a dough if the dough is on the firm side. As doughs get looser, it's harder to develop the gluten because there's less resistance to the dough, to the hook moving through the dough. So if you've got what's known as a planetary mixer, such as the one we're about to mix in, or even a home stand mixer, these are not particularly efficient mixers compared to, say, a spiral mixer, which you'd see in a professional bakery many times. And so in order to develop our dough adequately with a planetary mixer like a KitchenAid or a Hobart, for example, by leaving the sugar out, the dough will be firmer. And this might sound counterintuitive. After all, the sugar comes out of a bag. It's a dry ingredient. So if I leave the sugar out, wouldn't the dough be looser? The answer is actually no, because sugar in a technical sense functions as a liquefying agent in baking. So if we leave it out, it'll be easier to develop the gluten. Once we've done that, we'll add in the sugar, let it mix for a minute or two, and then last but not least, in goes the butter. So, another thing that's very common in professional bakeries that have these very efficient mixers is to mix at a fairly intensive speed. Many bakers like to mix their brioche dough until it has a complete window pane test. This can be really, really tough in something like a KitchenAid. So instead of mixing it on a higher speed, we'll mix it on a lower speed. It'll take longer. It might take as much as 8 minutes or so. But we don't want to stress out the machine. Now, again, the sugar's not in. So if I hear the dough sounding like it's too dry, in other words, if the hook seems to have trouble going through the mix, I don't want to burn out my mixer, so I'll add some or all of the sugar. But it's not a bad idea to leave it out at the outset, okay? All right. Oh, good, I'm going to borrow this from Gazina. So be patient. Expect this to take several minutes. Other things to keep in mind when you're working with brioche dough, a few things come to mind. One is that you can't use it at room temperature. It would be very, very sticky if you tried to. So the best process is to mix your dough on day one, give it an hour or two of room temperature fermentation to develop a little flavor, a little more flavor, and then degas it well, refrigerate it, and then once or twice over the next few hours, degas it again. You don't want to have a big buildup of carbon dioxide that's in the dough because it can produce some off flavors. So then you would use the dough the following day or the day after that. Brioche has a very good usable 48-hour shelf life after the mix, refrigerated. So if you were making brioche on an ongoing basis, you could mix it on Monday to use Tuesday, Wednesday, mix it on Wednesday to use Thursday, Friday, etc. So that's one thing. The second thing is I'm looking at this and it looks like it's going to be a little too dry without the sugar in it. So I'm going to add the sugar now. And again, that'll actually loosen up the dough a little bit. You can see how the dough is climbing up the hook. This is one of the defects of a planetary mixer. A spiral mixer, you wouldn't have that symptom, and it's going to be much easier for the dough to come together and develop. So I've just turned the mixer up to medium speed. This mixer is definitely beefy enough to be able to handle the dough mixing at this higher rate. Do be careful if you're mixing in a KitchenAid style mixer. Now and again, feel the top of the mixer, and if it's starting to feel warm, you might want to go down to low speed. You can see the ingredients are incorporated, and it's still having a little trouble mixing it, but anyway, the dough has come together. It's still far from ready for the butter, however. You can see it's still a bit shaggy on the top portion. There's a lot you can tell just visually about how the dough is developing. Gaining some strength. It's got some nice resistance when I pull on it, but I can still feel a little bit of the grain from the sugar. So we'll mix it for another minute or so. And while this finishes the development without the butter, I'm going to process the butter and show you how that happens. So Ray, if you keep this here, I'll be back in a second. Okay, it's just about ready for the butter. So here's how we handle the butter. I've just pulled it out of refrigeration. And when I press a finger into it, it won't really dent it. It's cold, brittle butter. If I put this into the mixing bowl, it would just break into shards that would never ever be incorporated by the dough. So it's a simple matter of pounding the butter. The temperature hasn't changed, but as you can see, now it's very easy for me to press my finger into it. So it's gone from this to this. This is something the dough can accept. So take your cold butter, pound it till it's pliable. There. Yeah. Okay, and now, very much based on what kind of mixer you have, you will have to scrape the bowl X number of times. A spiral mixer tends to come together without a lot of undue scraping, but with a planetary mixer, it wouldn't be unusual to scrape it 5 times. Now we're going to continue mixing until A, the butter is all absorbed, and we've got a beautiful, silky, velvety type of result. And in a spiral mixer, that might be 5 minutes, and in a planetary, it might be 10 minutes. So once again, you'll want to observe the dough as it develops rather than just put on a timer and say, well, that's the timer said it's done. You know better than the timer. If you happen to see the program that Gesine and I are doing where I'm doing things with brioche, you'll see that today I'm doing 2 savory things with brioche, both of which I'm very, very fond of. Okay, that's starting to show some strength, but it's not quite there yet. Okay, let's see what we've got here. Okay, it's certainly not super strong, but when I pull on it, there's adequate resistance. This could mix longer, but I'm going to call it done. Again, if your mixing style is to mix very intensively, you'd want to keep going. But I think this is going to be fine enough to make good products. This will now get 2 hours to sit out and ferment, after which it'll get refrigerated and it'll get twice or so degassed. So there is our brioche dough.